Welcome to Health Stealth Radio, where we move away from the mundane to gather insights from the shadows of enterprise and patient cybersecurity. Yes, we surely believe that traditional themes like endpoint software and zero trust are critical, but given massive advances in AI, remote and wearable device hacking, and data hostage negotiators, there's a much darker side to cybersecurity, and not everyone is quite willing to talk about it in public. Health Stealth Radio will thrive on these topics and encourage fireside spats to debate them. Here's your host, Frank Katita.
I'd like to welcome you to Health Stealth Radio. This is a program, as you know, that largely focuses on the shadows of cybersecurity, both on the patient and the enterprise side, but sometimes we like to dally around into other areas. Today, I have to admit that in the spirit of full disclosure, I have one of my dearest friends for the last over 35 years, Dave Moschella. We've worked very closely together over the years. We were both apostles of the legendary Pat McGovern. David ran the research operation at IDG, and I was running international there. So we got to travel around the world together, and then had a couple other stops together. Shortly after that, at Computer Sciences, which then became, what is it?
DXC.
DXC, I can never get it. I get DXL, which is the Fat Boy clothing store that I shop at. And then their leading edge forum research group, where we were both researchers. Dave headed up the operation there, and he gave me the luxury of writing some research with him. So today we're going to talk about Dave's book and his co-author's book. It's a mouthful. I tried to memorize it, but I'm going to have to read it. It's Technology, Fears and Scapegoats, 40 Myths about Privacy, Jobs, AI, and Today's Innovation Economy. So we've got a lot to talk about here. We usually don't get guests that have 40 things that they've already documented to talk about, but Dave has done that. He's a really, really smart guy, and if you want to hang around with smart people, Dave's one of the guys to do it with. So I'd like to introduce Dave and have him give his just a short background of what I haven't given. In absentia, I'd like him to introduce his co-author and his background. And then we'll open up the line of questioning. And as you know from previous programs, I like to call these not fireside chats, but I tend to turn them into fireside spats in an intellectual way. So without further ado, David Moschella.
Hey, Frank, good to see you and great to be with you and your audience. Yeah, just to expand on what you said about me, my role has always been to try to understand the patterns in the digital world, particularly competition and who's winning and why and what the next phases will look like. And sort of the roots of the book were that so many of the things that we were hearing about technology, that it destroys privacy and spreads information and undermines trust and harms children and it's just it was basically being blamed for every societal ill. So Rob Atkinson and I, and Rob, like you, I've known for many years, and Rob is the founder of a group called the Information Technology Innovation Foundation, which is the leading digital policy think tank in DC. And I've been working with that group for the last few years. And their role in this is to try to get Washington to believe in technology and pursue a more positive agenda. And I think in many ways, the Beltway area has been the leader in much of the tech bashing in recent years. So Rob and I have been looking at these 40 myths, as you say, for a while, and we compiled them into a bunch of short essays, taking on each one to try to tell a much more balanced and much more positive story about the impact of tech, and really to show that in many cases the tech world is being used as a scapegoat for other societal ills, and I'm sure we'll get into that.
So as I mentioned before, I mean, this is like having 40 children and picking which one, if you had to. I mean, obviously, I wish we had the time to go through all 40, but if we did that, then people wouldn't buy the book. So we want to make sure that we tease them a little bit with the best and some of the understated. So, I mean, if you had to pick one of the children, the 40 children here, that's probably the most profound that, if you never hear from me again or never see me again or don't read the book, I mean, here's one that you really should take home and think about.
Well, give me the liberty. I might pick two.
Okay, that's fine.
The first is that we hear over and over again that technology is changing the world as never before, and that the pace of change is accelerating like never before. And that's just simply not true. That the technology industry is roughly 60 years old. The first mainframe sort of in the early 1960s or so. And if you simply look at the technologies of the 60 years before that, you'll see that they had vastly more impact on society than anything in the digital world. And look back at the period of 1900 to 1960, cars and planes and trains and electricity and appliances and air conditioning and heating and cooling and lighting and clean running hot water. All of these things and many more had far more impact on people's lives than anything going on in the digital world today. And they happen actually much quicker. As I say, the tech world has taken 60 years to get to this point. Many of those technologies caught on in 10, 20 years. And I mean, you mentioned television, movies, and radio, and telephones, and all of these things that happened before, and that were overwhelmingly beneficial. And so people sort of make the case that things are changing faster and more than ever. And they use that for fear, but we had greater changes in the past. And you have to say they were overwhelmingly beneficial. So that sort of sets the larger picture of why we should be pretty positive about all this. The second one you hear, and you hear it every day now, is how technology and social media is undermining societal trust through misinformation, disinformation, and all that. And that is a classic example to me of scapegoating. If you want to know why societal trust has diminished, well, you can look at what the Catholic Church did and what the Boy Scouts did and the claims about weapons of mass destruction in the world. And you can look at claims about how the Wuhan, COVID was no way that it was a lab accident. And you can look at just across the board of, the financial crisis and all the things going on in the real world where our institutions have basically not told us the truth about things. And the undermining of societal trust and truth comes far more out of the non-digital world than the technology world. But it's very convenient for those people to say, no, it's all those unwashed masses saying things on social media, and they like to talk about QAnon and Alex Jones and all these relatively fringe players rather than core stories. You look at the Hunter Biden laptop story where the entire intelligence community tells us this is Russian information. And in fact, it wasn't Russian disinformation. So citizens have a very good reason to be skeptical and distrustful from both parties for a long, long time. And just blaming it on technology is just the easy way out.
The problem is that the distrust of analysts like you and I is become institutionalized and normalized. So no matter what we say, we're going to have to battle to go in the other direction. I just the first spat area. I just want to rewind and talk about you and I lived through some of these massive technology changes. I mean, we didn't have to be there for the invention of electricity or the telephone, but I mean, we had a couple of those in our boomer lives. For example, we go back about the invention of the browser, for example, and how life-changing that was. I mean, it's complete game changer. And we could say, to my 28-year-old daughter, you think this is moving fast. You should have seen when the browser was there. But the problem is, to your point, that people look at it in their own time frame. Like my daughter's 28, so when the browser was like ancient history to her. So when she really sees how disruptive technology is being, she sees it in the context of those 28 years that she's been alive. And I could say to her, it's the old, hey, boomer, Jenna, you think technology is moving fast now. You should have been there with the browser. And what does she do? Her eyes roll over and she's like, okay, Dad.
Yeah, and that's true. And that's always been true that I mean, basically every generation thinks their own times are the most
Yeah.
special. And you see that today with every election in my lifetime has been described as the most important election of my lifetime.
Mhm.
And they're doing that now. And in some ways that's just human nature, and in many ways it's fine and even in a good thing. But if you believe that your own times are so special, it will help you sort of not believe that the fact that previous changes were mostly for the better, it doesn't matter because you're sort of saying, well, my changes are bigger than those. And so it gives you
That's true.
a sort of
Change
exaggerated
envy.
thing to worry about, and
Yeah.
and therefore it contributes to sort of the negative and sort of paranoid mindset.
So we'll talk about some of these other things, but the one you were talking about with misinformation, disinformation, call it what you may. I don't disagree that there are, by the nature of the beast, that disinformation is confusing, and there's battlefields back and forth. That's always been there as well, as you said. But don't you think it's that what is different is not the disinformation part, but the velocity with which it's happening right now? I mean, it used to be, it used to be that word of mouth, that people would say, I heard a rumor, I saw this. But I mean, the sheer speed and velocity and controlling it, and it's a guy who has another business called Weapons of Mass Discussion. Uh, the part of the job is people like myself. They're trying to guide the conversations. We've done this in our careers in a direction where it probably should be, or maybe I could argue sometimes that maybe it shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean the speed and reach is greater, but of course one can see that as a good thing also.
Mhm.
That in the old days where the sources of information were controlled, it was much easier to put out misinformation. You look at Russia today. When once you start to control who can put out what, you can say any old thing. And the internet has always been, at least to a significant degree, a check on the false statements of the people in power. So
Mhm.
I would count that. And the other thing is, in terms of speed, nothing's faster than television. Television puts something on there. You
Mhm.
look at what happened with Trump on Saturday, and
Mhm.
boom, it's right there. And so that element's been there a long time, and I don't think is changed fundamentally. So, again, I come back to, yeah, you can find cases where bad ideas spread quickly, but I think if you look at it on balance, that's more likely to be a check on misinformation than an amplifier of it. But there's clearly both.
Really true.
I mean, you look at the fact-checking world and how quickly stuff can get out there now that never really happened in the past.
And everybody's still looking for the proverbial central source of truth that's really
Yeah.
not out there. So I mean I mean, we'll get to this because
Hmm.
my audience is largely people looking at us or listening to us right now are largely healthcare IT folks. We'll have some other people that are in other areas of healthcare, but they look at it somewhat differently in terms of central source of truth as their brand. That I'm Mayo Clinic, I'm Cleveland Clinic, and the brand will provide the central source of truth because it's one of the most sophisticated organizations in healthcare in the world. So I'm wondering, in that regard, with your myths, what would be some of the ones that would be most pertinent to healthcare? And I'll bring up one and I think you agree. You might have mentioned it before. The privacy and patient data.
Yeah,
Are there any myths or scapegoats in that area where we could say, data privacy is a scapegoat?
absolutely. And if you look at what's written about privacy, virtually all of the commentary is about the downsides, the way people can be tracked and profiled and targeted, and the risks of data getting out there and the potential harms of that, and surveillance and social credit and all of these things that are very real. And you look at China and you can see some of the downsides that are there. And so the privacy risks are quite obvious and quite clear and get plenty of attention, as they should. The problem is the privacy benefits get almost no attention whatsoever. And those are extremely valuable in the healthcare world.
Give
If
me an
you look,
example.
yeah, sure. I mean, every time people have take healthcare and gender and sexuality issues, they're very sensitive. And if people have an issue, a symptom, a question, they're not going to go run to their physician every single time. So what did they do in the past? Well, they often lived in complete ignorance, or maybe they try to find a magazine or a book to find things out. But the ability to do a search on my own symptoms, my own conditions, my own inclinations, my experiences, and to do that in in effectively extremely confidential way is of tremendous privacy gains to people. And so I think people really don't factor that in. Again, it's a question of balance. And for most people, they're essentially making a bet. They're saying, all right, if I enter this question into Google, yeah, the servers of Google remember that and they have that in their system. But the odds of that query, that search coming back to embarrass me or to haunt me or get exposed in any way are so much lower than if I ask a friend, a colleague, or someone about these things. And so that there's a reason people go to Google and all kinds of websites to ask confidential things, is because they believe that the risk of that information coming back to harm their privacy is actually extremely low. And so people are voting with their feet. And when you look at that, I mean, those sort of privacy gains are literally for, well, hundreds of millions of people in America and billions worldwide. And all right, so those are big numbers. Well, how many people have been harmed by that? Well, that's a hard number to get, but it's way orders of magnitude smaller. So again, it's not to dismiss the fears, it's not to dismiss the downsides, it's not to regulate some of those things, but to keep such a sense of balance that if you took away people's right to ask sensitive questions to the web, people would be really upset because they know, is there anybody out there who hasn't done a search, does something confidential about themselves or a loved one?
Well, there's a certain irony to this, Dave, and you know it yourself, is that as you know, and many people who've seen this program, I had my own stint of 100 days as an inpatient, and I spent a lot of time with COVID advocacy groups. The amazing thing is that despite the warnings about privacy, how open people are when they get into discussion groups about their ailments, which is it's so much more open than doing a Google search, which is relatively confined. So people, the thing is that people are willing to sacrifice the privacy for truthful information that somebody can empathize with. So some of this doesn't even have a bearing on Google or anything else. It's knowing when you've crossed the line and now you're outed. So one of my guests, I've had two previous guests. One was on hacktivism, how hackers are arguing about Hamas and Ukraine and things like that. And the other one was a lady by the name of Jackie Sanchez, who's a great friend, and she runs Planned Parenthood of Southwest Florida, the technology side of it. And she was talking about where that line is crossed in terms of the cybersecurity aspects of reproductive rights.
Yeah.
So because there's some scary things that were happening out there with her and her constituents, that if you said something or you went on Google Maps or something and did this and somebody broke in, they would see that you're crossing state lines to get an abortion. So the scary aspects of that, and I'm not saying this happens, and again, the scale of that is not universal, but the fact is that in Florida, if you're crossing to Alabama or you're crossing to one that will let you do it, there are some pretty profound aspects to this.
Yeah, without doubt. And there are real issues that, one of the things I like to stress to sort of bring this out is they've had a lot of hearings in DC about privacy. And if you watch any of those hearings, you will see the Congress people, senators, whatever, reps, whatever they are, and their questioning is so hostile and so accusatory that the whole discussion becomes one of sort of, let's get through this thing and clam up, and whether it's Zuckerberg or any of the top people, they get in there, they just want to get out of there. And they sort of, yeah, we've got some issues, we'll do better, we'll try. And they don't really go anywhere. And one of the things, if the conversation was different and the people said, hey, we really like some of the privacy gains that the internet, provides, but there's some issues we should work on. We're not here to bash you about this. We're here to work with you. You might actually get something done, but the whole thing becomes so overly inflamed and hostile that it doesn't go anywhere. And the real downside of that is because America hasn't really done much effective in the sense of privacy regulation, everything sort of reverts and cedes the field to the Europeans and their GDPR stuff. And by all accounts, that's just it's just a bureaucratic exercise that's done relatively little, but essentially America has ceded the field in that area. And people start to say, well, maybe, that might happen again with AI and some other areas. And so it's one of the reasons why I spent a lot of time with the policy group in Washington, because that really determines how America deals with a lot of these issues.
Don't you feel that, I mean, a lot of the people, when you watch these hearings, it's incredibly painful to watch, not because of the blame game, but because they're so ill-informed
Both,
that they might have a bench full of millennials and Gen X or whatever, but they just ask really stupid questions about technology that, you don't have to be in the technology business to know the answers to that. You should know the answer before you ask the question, type of thing.
Yeah, the TikTok ones were particularly hilarious, I thought. and still worth a read this to watch.
It really was. I mean, it was like a TikTok video that you were watching. So, I mean, we no interview or anything in healthcare, especially, can be complete without really talking about the generative AI phenomena and the debate of whether it's good, it's bad, it's hallucinating or not. What's the myth, the scapegoat, or what's the point of view that you as the authors have?
Well, the AI one is classic because, computer scientists have been trying to develop artificial intelligence, or what I prefer to call machine intelligence, because it's not really artificial. It's a machine that's pretty smart. And they've been working on that for really their entire length of the computer industry since the 50s. It's always been the holy grail of what they're trying to build. How smart can we make these machines? And just as they start to actually be able to do that, everybody turns against it and says, oh, wow, you shouldn't be doing that. And yet, first of all, there's no stopping it, that people are going to continue to push that field because competition and everything takes them that way. And second of all, they shouldn't. And I always, I think you can sort of sum up the situation as essentially real benefits and speculative fears. That the actual fears are things that, it's going to destroy human worth, and it's going to put us all out of jobs, and it's going to control us and go rogue, and one person will control the world, and all of these things that are plausible scenarios that maybe someday possibly could happen, but there's no real evidence that they are, and history suggests that they will absolutely not. And we can talk about AI a lot, but the one thing I would make is that in every field today, whether it's medicine or chess or strategy or anything else, the combination of machines and people outperform just a machine or just a person. And I don't know how you can see that as anything other than a positive. And the other thing I would add, then maybe let me stop there, but there's nothing I'll add. If you
No. I just jump in. I mean, we agree. I mean, in healthcare, we're looking at the migration with robotic process automation is really where it's at right now, doing mundane tasks, repetitive tasks, things like that, where it's not really going to be clinical decision support, where you're deciding whether, how to operate on the brain tumor using a machine to do it.
Yeah.
So that part is there. I think the question I wanted to ask you, which is tied in with what you were saying, and also with the work that you're doing in Washington, where do you see the governance of this? Because in healthcare, everything we're talking about with AI and healthcare enterprises right now is related to governance within that enterprise. who's taking control, how collaborative it is, what the ethics are, what the legalities are. Where do you see the government coming in with governance on artificial intelligence?
Yeah, and I hope they sit back and watch for a while, because I would make 2 points. The first is that existing laws cover a lot of things, that there are laws against for liabilities and fraud and copyright violations and all of these things. So the first thing is, how well can existing laws be applied rather than trying to write entirely new ones? And I think that's really important. The second thing about it is that we have to realize that we need all the AI we can get, that we're heading into a world of an aging societies, in many cases, sharply declining populations in Japan and Korea and much of
Italy,
Europe
yeah.
and other places. And so we basically are going to need all the automation that we can get in many areas. And if you look at Japan and South Korea are probably the two biggest examples of it. They know that they need automation, they need robots just to maintain their society over the next 20 and 30 years as their populations start to rapidly shrink. And in terms of governance, I would say that you keep those two things in mind, but basically they should deal with problems as they emerge rather than trying to write blanket laws. You look at something like deep fakes, and people were terrified that it was going to have all of these issues in the election and other things. And it turns out, even though deep fakes are incredibly good, that they haven't. But over time, laws will emerge in that particular area of what you can do in terms of copying Taylor Swift or Scarlett Johansson or all these sort of things that do go on right now. So I would say that the main thing with governance is to not try to write blanket AI laws, which would be sort of like writing blanket laws about databases or search or something. Try to write targeted ones. What does it mean to copyright? What does it mean to identity theft? What does it mean to fair use? And all of these things that I think will play out over time. It'll be real issues, just as they were with the internet and Google and search. And people had many of the same concerns of how you govern information in that world. And, there's been tough issues, complicated issues, but it hasn't been, this huge, dark world of things. So, I think the fears the title of the book is Fears and Scapegoats. And when I talk about trust, that was a scapegoat. This one's one of just fear. And when people say, oh, it's an atomic bomb moment, it's a Frankenstein sort of thing, it's HAL in 2001, it's all of these sort of deeply rooted fears that people have about technology going out of control. And that's fine. That's also human nature. But, when people start comparing it to the atomic bomb, I think that's just a terrible idea that, the atomic bomb, you don't want to have, we have nuclear proliferation treaties for a reason. We don't want to have AI non-proliferation. We need AI. And so that whole mindset of governance is wrong. And I think, there was a lot of talk about doing a lot of things to control AI years ago, but I think you've noticed that it really hasn't happened. And I think even in the last year, a lot of these fears have subsided because, in fact, the actual impact of ChatGPT is still relatively, it's an incredible thing, but it's still relatively modest in terms of jobs, the economy, strategy, or all of these things. So I think a lot of the hype is already sort of shrinking, and we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think there's been more damage done by Google Translate in the advertising business, where I used to be, as I ran international, people having their corporate brochures translated into German using Google Translate it goes back to your point, without human intervention. Like, okay, here's the translation. I'm going to send it over to our German subsidiary. I think one of the most important points that you made is, which is the constant debate, that artificial intelligence is going to put people out of work. And I think the point you made is really, just to magnify it a little bit, is that it's not in the places that you mentioned, in other places, it is the workforce that they don't have. as opposed to knocking people out of the workforce. So we're you know, I can't get people to do billing. I can't get people to do appointment scheduling. So it's filling that gap. So I'm begging you to come in with robotic process automation to fill the gaps that I just can't fill myself.
Absolutely. And it's a huge issue that worker shortages are the reality. And they come at a time where we also need to make these enormous transitions to, a non-carbon economy, to more sustainable food, to rebuilding torn cities and nations, and cleaning up the environment and improving. So there's so many enormous societal challenges that sometimes I think that we actually do need to take out about half of today's white collar workforce so they can go do other things that need to be done. And the analogy there is, there was a time where 80%, then 50% of Americans were farmers. And the reality is, to build the world we are now, we had to have them not be farmers. And these giant office towers full of white collar workers, in the short term, it isn't changing much at all, but in the long term, it almost should change, and probably does have to change. And maybe those office towers become vertical farms for whatever.
Well, but thank you for COVID to do a lot of that already for us.
Yeah, and so I think people underestimate the needs of the future, particularly given what I said before about aging and shrinking populations. The American population isn't shrinking because of the levels of immigration, but most developed nations are looking at serious declines. Japan, they talk about going from 120 million today to 70 million in 30 some odd years, and most of those being quite old. And how are you going to do that without incredible levels of automation? And automation is also the key to productivity and therefore wages and many things. And fear of automation is, of course, the other great fear, going all the way back to the Luddites. And essentially every innovation that's ever come up, the immediate reaction is, oh, it's going to put people out of work. But the reality is we have worker shortages.
So you come up with a list of 40 things, and people say, but wait, how about this one? So I'm sort of looking for, are you taking nominations for the next 40? And what one, for example, that I mentioned to you one other time is that I'm in healthcare, so interoperability is it's huge. And one of the great quotes that I heard was that it could be a myth, or you could use it as a scapegoat, but the quote from a famous healthcare provider CEO was that interoperability is not a technology problem.
Well, that happens to be an issue. I had a lot of firsthand experience. When you mentioned I used to work for the services company DXE, well, we used to run a lot of the healthcare systems for the UK National Health Service. And part of the biggest job they ever had was to try to tie the regional hospital networks into an integrated system. And it proved impossible. Not because of technology, but because every region didn't want to change their system. Every region said it's not worth it for me to do the cost of doing the change just for this larger long-term goal. We have short-term problems right now. So your basic point of interoperability is much more of a human short-term problem than it is a technical one. But the technical transitions to get there do take time, effort, and expense, and those are often lacking, and so you don't get it. But your first initial question about other myths is funny, because when Rob and I started the book, we said, all right, let's come up with 100. And we started trying to make a list of 100, and we sort of got there. And then we said, all right, let's narrow it down to 50. And we had 50, but then we realized that 40 was going to take 300 pages to do. So we went with 40, with sort of the, 40 days and 40 nights, or top 40, whatever. We went with that sort of metaphor, but there are definitely others. We had many other candidates, but we tried to pick the 40 that we thought were best.
Well, what was there? I have to break in here. Thank you for listening to Health Stealth Radio. My producer always wants to strangle me because I always forget to put a shameless plug in here. I'm with Dave Moschella, who is a great author. We've discussed his book, and thank you for your support of Health Stealth Radio. We hope you continue following us. And now back to Dave. So, is there one that you just didn't make the cut, but really sort of the Sophie's Choice thing? I wish I could have that one back.
Gosh. I honestly can't think of one because, as I said, we tried to pick the 40 best. So there were
Uh,
others, but they were almost by definition not as good. No, sorry, I just
you got
I
them
can't think
all?
of one offhand.
That's okay. That's all right.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're approaching our time here. I could ask a bunch more questions, and I'm hoping that as this transpires, that you do the next 40, and we get to see that on the digital version of the book. Until we get to a point where you could update a print book in real time. So I'd like to thank you for your time, Dave. Your friendship, and it's just been great. And hope we could bring back you again as a subject matter expert, especially on the regulatory side, because we're doing a lot of work at Chime in that area on both cybersecurity, privacy, and artificial intelligence. So thank you again, and we look forward to having you again on the
And
program.
thank you, Frank. Always great to see and work with you. It's like old times. Good to see you, man.
It is. We'll do that again.